Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, leading publishers of books, directories, educational guides and magazines aimed at schools in the UK and beyond. Enjoy the podcast.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The Late Show on Teachers Talk Radio. Really excited about the show this evening. We're discussing possible alternatives to OFSTED. If you are joining, perhaps you are listening live, perhaps you are listening back to this as a podcast, perhaps you are listening to this outside of the United Kingdom and perhaps don't know what OFSTED is. So in a moment, I will start off with what OFSTED is. But before we go on to that, I just want to give a shout out to our partners on the podcast this evening, which is John Catt Educational. If you want to find out more about John Catt, perhaps explore some of their titles and books, you can do that on their website, which is johncattbookshop.com. And we've pinned a tweet into the space, so you can do that at your own leisure during the show this evening. I'm really excited I'm privileged to have three guests this evening. I'll talk about them in a second. The first guest is Martin. Hopefully we can bring him in imminently. But just while we are sort of bringing our guests together and getting the show together, I want to just outline what OFSTED is. So OFSTED is the school's inspectorate body in England. It is the body that is tasked by the government to inspect schools. And in the last few weeks, it's come under fire due to controversies and issues that have arisen specifically due to the grading system and the impact of that grading system on different schools and teachers and communities around the country, around England in particular. Scotland and Wales have different inspection bodies and systems, and we'll discuss those later on. And in fact, the two guests that I have coming on later, one of them being Kate Barry, currently teaches in the Republic of Ireland. So we will be discussing in detail how Kate, first of all, the entire system in the Republic of Ireland, but particularly teacher accountability and how that works in that particular country. But that will be later. To actually begin the entire show this evening, I'm very delighted that I'm going to be able to speak, hopefully imminently, to Dr. Martin Hanbury, who is the CEO of a trust in Salford, Manchester. And you may have seen across the TTR Twitter and also my own Twitter just recently, Martin kindly shared his resignation letter, which he sent to Amanda Spielman, who's the director of OFSTED, and it was sent to her to let her know and OFSTED know that Martin would no longer be an inspector for OFSTED. I'm going to read the first two paragraphs of the letter. It's quite an extensive letter, so I don't want to sort of read the whole thing, but I will read the first two paragraphs to give you the gist. It says, "Dear Amanda, it's with regret that I'm writing to inform you of my decision to stand down as an OFSTED inspector. I've served on 33 inspections since 2017, leading 13 of these, largely focused in the field of special educational needs and disabilities. I have found inspection to be fulfilling and stimulating and hope I have contributed to the improvement and development of the schools that I have inspected." He then goes on. "However, in recent months, I have increasingly felt that OFSTED is no longer achieving its mission of raising standards, improving lives. This creeping disillusionment was set in stark relief by the tragic death of Ruth Perry. OFSTED's tone-deaf response to Ruth's death has troubled me to the extent that I can no longer be associated with the organisation." They were the first two paragraphs of Martin's resignation letter to OFSTED. I'm hoping we can connect Martin up. I know he's in the space. His Twitter handle is @mankred63. And I have invited you to speak, Martin. I'm going to leave you in the capable hands of our admin tonight, which I think is Nathan, to see if he can help you to get connected into the show. While we're waiting for Martin, Kate has joined me. Kate, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes, Tom. Can you hear
Excellent.
me?
I can clearly. How are you this evening?
I'm very well, thank you.
Fantastic. Now, where exactly in the world are you calling in from?
I'm calling from Cork in the Republic of Ireland, and I'm a secondary teacher. I teach English and French in an all-girls school in North County Cork.
Wow. Now, let me ask you a question to start off with. Do teachers ever leave Irish schools?
Rarely.
Because the only reason I asked that,
rarely.
yeah, because I trained as a teacher in South Wales, and I remember I trained with a lot of Irish teachers, and I always remember the chats we had, and I was mates with some of them, and I always remember the chats we had were like, we can't get a job in Ireland. We'll have to come to, we don't want to come to England or Wales, but we have to because we cannot get a teaching job in Ireland. And I always found that really interesting because, like, is that because? I mean, tell me why. Tell me why.
It can be difficult. There was certainly for some years there probably was oversupply in people training, and especially in some subjects. Now that's actually turned on its head now, and there's now a recruitment crisis in Irish post-primary education, and it's particularly acute in some subjects. But it has really turned on its head. I think when I trained as a teacher, a regular part of our lectures would be people coming in from recruitment agencies from the UK, like, who were just begging people and to go over there, and now I'm not sure if those agencies are still trying to recruit Irish teachers, but I do know that it's the situation has reversed here.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we're not here to talk about sort of recruitment in Irish schools. I mean, but I thought I'd ask you that because it's always interested me. What have you ever taught outside of Ireland, or have you only ever taught in Ireland?
I've only ever taught in Ireland. I was a late entrant. I think I was like 29 when I trained, and I was able to train in a year. I came out, like, I already had a degree that I'd done a few years ago, and like within 12 months of me starting my teacher training, like, I was very lucky. I got a full-time job straight away, and whereas now that path wouldn't be available to me now.
Why is that?
It would now, in an effort to try to, I think, improve standards, it was decided that all post-primary teachers should be educated to master's level. So the HDiv in education that I did is now a professional master's in education that takes 48 months to qualify. So it's now 2 years.
Wow.
And that could be on top of, so it could take up to 6 years now. Say if you did a science degree, or that was 4 years, and then you trained to be a teacher, like, that's 6 years of training, and that's very often funded by the trainee teacher themselves.
Wow, that's So I can understand that now, that it's difficult. So how many years have you been, sort of including your training as well? How many years have you been involved in teaching in Cork Island?
I trained up in Galway. So overall, it is it's 18 years.
Wow.
Trained in Galway, and then I worked in Dublin for a year, and then I was out around the place for a year doing substitute work, and then I have been in my current role. I'd say we're at 15 years now.
Yeah, that's a lot of time. So yeah, I will send you a certificate in the post after this, I promise. Martin, I know Martin's joined us. So Martin, I'll come to you in a bit. I'm just going to speak to Kate for a little bit, because the whole sort of purpose of the show this evening was around alternatives to OFSTED. So the way in which England inspects is very much inspections every few years that last for 2 days, and then at the end of the 2 days, a judgment is made on the school, and that judgment is inadequate, requires improvement, good, or outstanding. And some schools, if you get inadequate, can be put into special measures and potentially closed. Is sort of the end result, or amalgamated into other schools and so on. So, Kate, what in Ireland? Well, I want to ask you about a more general question first about workload, because there was a survey that came out that was leaked through the DFE just a few days ago, where 1 in 5 teachers in England said they were working 60 hours or more each week during term time. Many of the others surveyed said it was sort of, workload was unacceptable. So I wonder, from your perspective, what is your sort of take on workload in Ireland? Are there similar issues there, or is it lower than 60 hours a week?
It's overall, I would say it's lower. Certainly, talking to colleagues who have worked in the UK system, or who've worked in the English system in particular, would say the level of bureaucracy that's in English schools is, they would say, off the scale compared to what we would have been used to in Ireland. I would say it's increasing. I would say our workload is increasing, and it is increasing in that area of bureaucracy, and it's going in that direction. But I would say we're nowhere near actually, I was going to say achieving those levels of workload, but I think achieving probably isn't the right word, because I think the costs that come with that, they're not, I can't see that those would be borne out in better outcomes for students.
Got you. Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting, because I think around the world there's different levels of workload by the country, depending on the surveys that you read. So I just wanted to ask you that first. But my bigger question, and the sort of theme for tonight, is alternatives to Ofsted. So can you tell me a little bit about the way in which teachers and schools are inspected in Ireland?
Yeah, there are some similarities between Ireland and the English system. One in particular is that our long-standing chief inspector, Harold Hislop, actually came originally from the UK, and there are lots of similarities. We've different types of inspections. We do have the kind of what's called a WSE, like a whole school evaluation, which sounds something along the lines of the Ofsted inspector, where it's a very kind of 360 look at the school, and a small team of inspectors would come to the school and look at everything, including lessons, and meet with various stakeholders. And we also have subject inspections, which I'm not sure what if you have those or not. And that's probably the most common type of inspection that we have, where the inspectors come in and they just look at the provision in one particular subject. And we have something as well that what are called incidentals. They're known as drive-by, which are no.
Like the sound of that, Kate, very much. Is that like the Irish alternative to deep dives, a drive-by?
A shallow dive, a kind of a skim, where they those are like the lowest stakes, so the least notice.
Right.
Like for those you get no notice, like the inspector, you just come into the school and at 8 o'clock there's a strange car in the car park and everybody goes, oh, is it the inspector? And
so let's just pause a second there. So these are inspector. Is it one inspector or a group of inspectors?
For that, it would be just one inspector. And
so it's one inspector who is presumably an expert within that subject.
Oh yeah,
that's coming to look at that one subject.
Sorry, yeah. For the incidentals, they could go to any subject, and they would normally see just around 4 maybe teachers that day, and they would usually look at a mix of subjects. For the subject inspections, they're always a teacher, and they're always an inspector who would have experience of teaching that subject, so they are a subject specialist. And for those, we would get 5 working days notice.
Right, so hang on. So there's the incidental ones, which are sort of like spot check
Yeah,
visits?
they're
Like
just spot checks. They're fairly low stakes. Those ones.
that, when you say they're low stakes, what do you mean by that in terms of the actual? How are you describing them as low stakes? Like, does nothing happen at the end of them? It's just a spot check.
It's just really a spot check. They would meet with the teachers afterwards. The kind of verbal feedback. There's a short bit of written feedback that's they meet with the principal, and there's a short written feedback that goes to the board.
Yeah.
But those aren't published on the inspectorate website, whereas the subject inspections, all the other types of inspections, a report is produced and then they're publicly accessible on the inspectorate website. So the stakes would be higher.
And how long does an incidental inspection last? Is that just a day one?
That's just a day, yeah.
Just a day. And then, so the subject, so you've got your incidental one, which is a 1 day spot check inspection by somebody, one inspector who might come in and look at 3 or 4 subjects in the day and then give a feedback to the head, which is not published publicly, right? That's one, isn't it? That's step 1. And then step 2 is the subject inspection. So tell us a little bit about the subject, a little bit more about those ones.
You get notice 5 days in ahead, and they would come and look at the subject in quite a lot of depth. They would try and visit all of the teachers in the department. Now that mightn't be possible if it's a big department, and they would normally stay 2 to 3 days in the school. During that time as well, they would look at the planning, all the digital folders that are there that are related to teaching and learning in that subject are available to the inspector. Then they're looking for things like is there evidence of collaborative planning, or a recent development is they've started meeting with focus groups of the students, and they're looking for alignment between what's set out in the plans and what the feedback then they get from the students as to is this actually happening. And then
that's interesting, isn't it? What's the sort of vibe with that? Are people okay with that new bit of sort of student voice? Because I guess that's like student voice a little bit, isn't it? Coming in a lot more.
It is. It's very positive. I had questions about it when I heard about this happening. I thought it sounded, I would have had questions about it, but anybody I've spoken to, they've said that it's been very positive, that that really they're just asking them about what's their experience of the subject in school, and how are they finding it, that it's not, they're not necessarily trying to quiz the children too much, that it is just trying to see, is there alignment there, that the what's in the plans is what's actually happening in the classroom.
Brilliant. Okay, so the inspection, the subject inspection, how long do those ones last?
I think depending on the subject, generally 2 or 3 days.
Yeah. I mean, that's quite positive in the sense that because I know one big complaint in England, and actually in other countries as well, that have any sort of visitation inspection system, is that if you get someone who has never taught the subject before, doing what in England would be termed like a deep dive into the subject, so like where you have meetings about the curriculum and all that sort of stuff, that have no idea about the technicalities of teaching that subject, which can happen quite a lot, so that sounds, I mean, that must be a benefit, I'm guessing. Like, how many of these have you been subject to, these subject reports? Personally,
I think 3, and one was actually a subject which is history, that I was teaching a very small group of 4 students who were finding it very difficult to access the history curriculum in the classroom for various reasons. And I took them as a small group, and when the inspector came, the days that he was there, I wasn't timetable to teach them, but I remember he met with me and he went through I had exercise books that they had, I had tests that they had done, assessments I'd done, and he was, because they were in the they weren't with me every day. Some days they were in the mainstream class and some days they were with me. And he was really interested. I remember like that I was working with the classroom teacher in kind of the selecting what parts of the curriculum that I was going to focus on and aligning it with the days then that they were in with the mainstream teacher, that so that they had a kind of continuity of experience of the subject. And back then we used to have, now that's gone now, we used to be able to enter them for the exams at different levels. So these students would have done the exam at a different level. And they did really well. Like we were able to cut out, you know, a lot of the course that the mainstream class was doing. So they maybe did less at a slower pace, but then they kind of knew it at the end of it. And he was very positive about that.
Interesting. So when was the last one of these you experienced? How long ago? Was it recent?
That was around 5 years ago. But we had them, say my school, we usually have at least one subject inspection a year. So, and sometimes, and often two. So like at least every school, I'd say, would have at least one or two subject inspections every year.
Okay. Oh, right. Really?
Yeah.
Right. So, hang on. Whoa, did I hear that right? So every subject has a subject inspection every year?
No, like every school would have one or two years.
One subject inspection each year, but in a different subject each year.
And it could be more than that. You know, it could be 2 or 3.
Got you. So in terms of the outcomes of one of these subject inspections, like what do the outcomes look like? How's that done?
It's interesting that there's a report that's written up, and then before that's published on the website, that goes back to the school and it's looked at by the subject department, by management in the school, and it goes to the school's board of management, which is like the board of governors, and they have a right of reply. So if there's anything that they feel has been misrepresented, or if there's any factual errors, that can be dealt with before it's then published openly.
Wow, that's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because that's one sort of criticism that's once again reared its head in England in the last few weeks, is this idea of a complaints procedure for Ofsted in England. So I guess in Ireland, if they're able to almost dispute the report while it's in draft form, would that be a sort of accurate representation?
Yeah. And that
basically,
you know, it could be upheld. In general, they would tend to be kind of factual things, or say if there was anything in it that you might feel that one individual teacher was easily identifiable or something, you know, they might ask for wording to be slightly changed. It's generally very small things but it's very good. Like those are dealt with they're kind of dealt with at that stage.
Yeah, so they're dealt with between the subject inspection and the report being published on the inspectorate's website, right? So what in terms of like you don't have grading, right, for schools, so you don't have the outstanding, good, requires improvement, inadequate.
We've something similar in that they do grade the inspections, and we go from very good, and it's interesting, very good includes outstanding, so there isn't an extra for outstanding. Very good includes the rating of outstanding, down to weak. But they would grade various elements within the school, rather than give, so for example, like management, student voice, leadership, teaching and learning, rather than give a single.
So there's no overall grade, is what you're saying?
No.
There's no like, this school is weak.
No. And a huge difference, I think, is the public perception of it. That I see on the websites of UK schools, you know, they'll have links and they'll have quotations from their Ofsted, and I've even seen billboards outside schools with, you know, your school.
Yeah. And on buses. I've seen them on buses. And on the back of planes being flown over Premier League football grounds. I'm joking. I haven't seen that, but I wouldn't be surprised if I did at some point. But yeah, what were you going to say? The difference is that you don't see that.
You really don't. The stakes are very much, I think, internal within the education system around prestige. Like certainly, like if you're a subject inspection, you don't want to let your department down within the school. You don't want to be the department that has a weak inspection report. But in terms of, say, at my age now, I've got a lot of friends whose children are transitioning from primary school to post-primary school. And when I hear them discussing about which schools they're going to choose, and in Ireland, people generally have, especially if you're in an urban area, like you do have choice amongst, fairly free choice,
Yeah.
where you send your children as long as they're not oversubscribed. And it's very rare that they would, I'd say I've never heard somebody say that they went online and they looked at the inspection reports and that influenced their decision.
Because I'm guessing as a parent, you'd sort of go, and I'm not a parent, full disclosure there, but I'm guessing as a parent, you would probably look at that when your kids in your city, you wouldn't be as interested in, okay, the art department was judged as good, and the in the subject report, you might be. I guess if your son or daughter was like really interested in being an artist when they were older, you might look at it maybe, but like, yeah, it doesn't. I'm guessing what you're saying is it wouldn't reflect as much on the whole school or whole school community. One of these subject reports.
No, or even the whole school evaluations, which are quite deep and which do give a quite comprehensive view of what goes on in the schools. As much as any inspection can. And I know there's loads of things that go on in school that aren't that easily seen by inspectors. But even those outside the education system, they're not. I'd say parents or other people in the community who don't work in education wouldn't know where to find them, or even that these things exist.
Wow. Yeah, I'll come on later because and we're going to talk to Martin in a minute, who has just quit as an OFSTED inspector, and then after that, I've got Jennifer on as well, who is an expert on the sort of teacher accountability in the Nordic countries. So it'll be interesting to hear on Finland and other countries, sort of, where they go with this and how they do things. But I do find it interesting. I was speaking to an Italian teacher just last week in preparing for this show, and several of his friends who were also Italian teachers, one of them had never been inspected in 20 years. Now, I know in Ireland you're inspected, but what I find interesting is this idea that parents don't need to sort of, it doesn't hinge on this inspection process as to school choice. Or, do you have league tables in Ireland of schools, stuff like that?
We don't. It's actually illegal in Ireland to compile league tables based on examination results. Schools will often on their websites, and I think that is something maybe that the parents would look at, is they would say, so many of our students, percentage of our students earned so many points in the Leaving Cert, like the equivalent of A levels.
Yeah.
Now a couple of the newspapers get around this, that every year they compile what they call school league tables, but the metric that they use is they're able to get data from the third level institutions as to where the students come from, and they use these to say, well, like, this is like the best school in the country because 100% of their leavers, say from last year, are now at university, and that's how they compile the lists. But it's, I think, I'm not sure. I'm sure some parents do read those and think that that's a good measure of what the school is.
Yeah,
But
of something.
not
But
that seriously within education.
But that's really interesting, that idea that it's illegal in Ireland to compare schools based on the student results. I find that really, really interesting, because I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's seen as being that it would lead to perverse incentives.
Yeah, which it does in England. Trust me, the whole thing. Well, that's it, in my opinion. I should hasten to add there will be others who think it's a fantastic idea to have the league tables there based on subject.
It could well be changing, and there's a bill going through the Oireachtas, the Irish Parliament at the moment, and it's currently at stage 8 out of 11 stages, and it's a parent and student charter bill, which will it'll require every school to draw up a charter as to how they deal with students and parents. And I think the idea behind that is to have like greater transparency. So possibly like the guidelines, like it's still at the stage it hasn't been enacted yet, and then the department, there'll be secondary legislation that'll set out what's expected to be in these charters. But it's possible that would include data around assessments.
Right. Ugh. Right. Interesting. But I mean, a lot of what you've said, I found that so interesting, Kate, to hear, the pros. I didn't have a clue about the sort of the way it's done in Ireland. So that's, and how often are these subject inspections? Do you have a cycle or not? Is it or is it just completely random?
There is. Oh, I think if we knew, there kind of isn't. I think there is an internal mechanism within the inspectorate that's opaque and that we don't know. You kind of know if you haven't been inspected for a few years that you're probably due, and around the whole school inspections as well. Every year that goes by that you don't have one increases the likelihood the following year that one. So they do get around to everyone.
But are the teachers sort of thinking about it a lot? Is it on their minds a lot? Are we going to get or not? Would you say?
It's always there. I think it's there in the back of our minds. I think you kind of do certainly sometimes take decisions around thinking, if you're not sure what to do about something, you might say, well, if we had an inspection, what would they look for? Certainly around things like planning, around kind of documentation and kind of evidence around what you're doing, but not to the extent that I hear in England, where it's a worry. It's more, it is kind of always there, in the background, if I'm honest. But not, it's not that huge source of stress. It's just kind of something that you're aware of, that you kind of have to take into account, but not to the extent that you'd be lying awake at night worrying.
Yeah. I've got you. Not where it's sort of like, this is, if we pass or, in inverted commas, pass or fail this, it's the end of my career. No. It's not sort of that level of things. Really interesting, Kate. I mean, Kate, feel free to stick around. I don't know what your sort of timetable's like this evening.
No,
but if you want to sort of stay as a speaker, then great. You can sort of stay and then maybe get involved in the conversation later on. If you need to go, feel free to. It's been fantastic. Really, really interesting talking to you. So I'm just going to mute you for now, Kate.
Thanks for having me on.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Cheers, Kate. Bye-bye.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
Now, Martin, if you want to unmute yourself in the bottom left-hand side, we can hopefully...
Hello, Tommy, okay?
Yes, not too bad. And yourself?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm fine.
Right. I mean, I know you've listened to that from Kate. What did you think of that?
As you said, it was very, very interesting. I think I put in the chat to you there that my wife's from Cork, so my ears picked up from that. Yeah, very interesting. set of regimes, isn't it? And talking to colleagues over the years who work on the continent, and a number of contacts we've had with other schools out there, that to them the Ofsted regime does seem very strange. Our colleagues in a school that we're connected with in Cologne recently have had some sort of regulatory framework brought in, but it was completely sort of an alien notion to them that people would come into the school the way that Ofsted would. And having been in their schools and spent quite a lot of time with these people, their schools don't look any the worse for it. And I think that's one of the important questions we've got to ask, and certainly a question I've been asking myself is, what value is Ofsted adding to education? Is it helping us improve schools? Is a simple question, isn't it?
Right. Let me cut to the chase here, Martin. You have resigned as an Ofsted inspector. Just in was it in the last few weeks?
It was last weekend, yeah.
Last weekend. So tell me a little bit about that. Tell me a little bit about what's going on.
Well, I trained originally in 2016 because I'd been a head teacher for a number of years, and I'm in the special school sector, and I felt that there was something of a lack of expertise around SEN, which is understandable because it's a complex area. And so I decided, instead of moaning about it, Martin, do something about it. So I trained as an OI back in 2016 and been serving on inspections since then. And I've led a fair few as well. And initially, I felt that yes, I am contributing something here. I'm hopefully helping schools develop, and certainly learning a lot myself about different school organisations and different contexts in which people have to work. In recent years, and I think particularly sharpened by the pandemic, I'd felt a sort of growing disillusion because the purpose of Ofsted is there to improve, and I started to think that actually we're inhibiting schools here. We're not helping schools to develop. And there was a number of key things around it. Most pointedly, what I think is just an observed reduction of a school into a single term, be it inadequate, requires improvement, good or outstanding. I don't think any of those terms are particularly helpful, and I certainly think that the lower two grades can be very damaging for schools, as we've seen, and very damaging for individuals. So I just felt like I couldn't, in all conscience, continue working for a system that I no longer believed in. So,
what's your experience of Ofsted inspections?
It varies. I mean, in some experiences, it has been positive. It's been that, as a head teacher, I've had Ofsted inspectors come into my school who have been quite frankly awful, and very much with their own agendas other than trying to understand the school community that I serve. I've had other Ofsted inspectors come into my school that have helped improve the school, that have given us pointers for where we should be going, and helped us develop as an educational establishment. As an inspector, I've been on inspections where I thought, yeah, we've done good there. We've done a good thing. I've had others where I've felt a little hollow at the end of it because we've either not been. More often, Tom, it's that you can't praise a school for what it's doing because of the restrictions around the reporting processes and language. I did an inspection. I'm not going to name names, obviously, but I did an inspection about 18 months ago in a school that I thought was a cracking school. We're doing really good work with complex kids in a difficult socio-economic environment, really helping their communities and some of the most vulnerable people within those communities. And yet I was restricted on what I could say about it, because if I was too effusive, I had to find all the evidence that didn't really exist to give it the highest grade possible. In other respects, you've got schools that are devastated by getting, so either an inadequate grade or requires improvement grade. So it's very mixed. And I think this is part of my problem, Tom. It shouldn't be as haphazard as it's starting to feel.
What's the process? Like, you've been an Ofsted inspector, so I think you said you'd led was it 13 or something, and you've done 33 and something like that. So what happens in advance of the inspection? Can you talk me through the process from the very beginning to when you walk through the doors?
And actually there's loads of really important stuff that goes on before that. I think it's really crucial to bring to people's attention. So you will be assigned an inspection several weeks in advance. You'll get the on your portal, because you have a portal as an inspector. So on your portal will come up a postcode and a local authority, and you'll know you'll be working in that area on those dates. Depending on whether you're the lead or the team member, further information will go on to that. And roughly a week, 10 days before, as a lead inspector, you'll be given the information about the school you're going to inspect. You can then start to do your research on it, and you start to develop an evidence base, which now is all electronic, but formerly you would do according to a written format. You develop your sort of initial views of the school by trawling the website, by looking at any information that might be out there in the local media or the national media in some cases. You will start to gather information from Ofsted's own data analytics and the IDSR. You can look at previous performance of the school. You read previous Ofsted reports, and you start to build up a picture of the school. You then get to a point where a couple of days before, you'll start in your own head to draft a kind of timetable for the inspection and develop, these days, the methodology, depending on whether you're doing what's known as a graded inspection or an ungraded inspection. You'll set together your own short schedule for the time so that you can look into, you've mentioned deep dives already, that you'll be looking into certain areas. You identify the ones that you want to look at. And it's always good to be open about what the school might want you to look at. So you go through that process, and then, of course, on the morning of the preceding the inspection, the administrators make the call to the school in the first instance. Then you follow that up within the next sort of half hour or so, and you have the long conversation with the head teacher and or any other senior leaders that are around, and you start to sort of investigate certain key lines of inquiry with them.
Do you think that, because I've heard this expression many, many times over the previous years, lines of inquiry, right? And surely there is some bias in there, because regardless of how well-meaning and well-intentioned a human being is, when in that pre-inspection part of the process, when as you say, you're looking at media reports, you're looking at this and that and previous inspection reports, whatever, surely you're building an interpretation of the school that will then feed into how you go about the inspection.
I mean, I'd like to caveat all that by saying Ofsted no longer use the term lines of inquiry.
No, they don't. But I'm saying that there are those out there who would say, regardless of whether they use the term or not, many people who criticise Ofsted report that the inspectors turned up with a preconceived agenda. That's what they would say. Those people who say that, it was obvious that they were looking for certain things when they walked through the door.
I think that's, I think that is possible. I think that what is a good inspection involves somebody gathering intelligence, keeping an open mind, and within Ofsted's training, which generally is very good, I have to say, but within Ofsted's training, they will encourage you to leave your baggage at the door. So whatever you like in a school isn't necessarily going to be the right thing to comment on, and to keep an open mind. However, any subject or any activity that involves human beings to some extent is going to have subjectivity around it. And all you can do is try and ladle in as much professionalism and experience as you can in order to mitigate against that. But I think it is possible that there would be inspectors or teams of inspectors that do very much have an agenda as they go into schools, simply because you're there to form an impression, and you can't not have formed one before you go in. Now,
do you think it's fair to say, though, that and this is from Tom, who's messaged in, He said, is it fair to say that many lead inspectors have made up their mind on a grade before setting foot in that school?
Not in my experience, but I think it's possible.
Yeah.
I think I think what you're trying to do as a lead inspector is gather information, gathering evidence, form an impression, because obviously you know it's a human thing to form an impression, isn't it? But the majority of inspectors I've worked with have been very good people and very skilled people, and they haven't formed a preconception. However, some, I believe, would do. And I believe as a head teacher, I've experienced people who have come in with an agenda. And I'm prepared to be concrete in my examples about this because it's about my own school. I had an inspection maybe 10, 12 years ago where the lead inspector had come in to hammer us on attendance. Now, in the special school setting, attendance is challenging, as you can imagine, what many children, medical conditions, etc., etc. And that lead inspector at that point, within 10 minutes of the inspection, was saying to me, if these attendance figures are right, you're going into special measures. And that was before we'd even, well, we'd barely sat down to talk together. So I have experienced it from that side, definitely.
Yeah, so, I mean, then, I'm thinking, I'm trying to get in the head of an inspector like yourself during the process. I mean, tell me about some difficult moments you've had during inspections as an inspector.
Well, I mean, what you've got to...
I mean, you sort of touched on one earlier.
Yeah, but... I mean, what you have to bear in mind is that when you're inspecting, the person that you're most interacting with, or the deepest level of interaction, is usually the head teacher. And sometimes, with other senior leaders around them. But head teachers, by their nature, they're woven into their school communities. They're deeply embedded there. They're not doing it as a job. It's a vocation for the vast majority of head teachers and school leaders. So when you are having to talk to them about difficult things in their school communities, that's always going to be a difficult conversation. However, the vast majority of heads are very attuned to that. They're aware of it. They're not naive. Difficulties as an inspector can arise when a head teacher may be either a little rose-spectacled about their own school, or that they're trying to kind of push or promote their school to an extent that it doesn't really merit. Those are some of the more difficult times in schools, in school inspection with the head. You can also have difficult times talking with members of staff who very often will do the rabbits in a headlights moment, and really, headlights, yeah. Well, yeah, they still exist in schools as well, I have to tell you. But a rabbit in the headlights moment where, particularly younger members of staff who think, oh my God, I'm going to let my school down if I mess something up. And you're getting people at a certain point of emotional rawness. And I think this is part of my thing around Ofsted being tone deaf at the moment, is it's missing how emotionally embedded the whole inspection process is. And, the recent events that have been tragic have really brought that to stark relief, haven't they?
How have those events affected you, Martin, on a personal level?
They've made me question what I'm doing. I mean, I think I was questioning anyway where Ofsted was going, as I've said before, particularly around the sort of grading. The whole reporting and grading system, I think, needs a complete overhaul. But, to see the impacts on that I've experienced with lots of people, actually, that I've seen the emotion and been through it myself, of trying to keep an inspection positive for your school against, mounting odds these days. There's not anybody, I'm sure, on this call who thinks that teaching is easy at the moment. Recent events have made me really question what the benefit of Ofsted is when we're seeing it having, in some cases, tragic results. And at its best, is it making that positive difference it's supposed to?
Yeah, I mean, this is something you mentioned earlier as well, and you mentioned it in your letter, the sort of impact of Ofsted on improvement, on helping schools. And you were saying that, you didn't feel it did have any.
Well, I don't think. I mean, Ofsted is a very evidence-based process, or the Ofsted inspection is supposed to be a very evidence-based process. Either as a head teacher having to produce evidence that your school's of the level you claim it is, or as an inspector trying to gather evidence to justify your judgments. But Ofsted themselves, I don't think, are producing any evidence that they are improving schools. And in fact, if you use their own measures, schools are declining in quality. So, there are less outstanding schools than there were 5 years ago. Many outstanding or historically outstanding schools are being downgraded to good. Now, that's their measure. Now, Ofsted may argue, well, the framework's changed, etc., etc. In that case, was your framework right? Do you know what I mean? So I think there's a real question about whether they're improving schools. And when you listen to people like Kate talk, or colleagues that I've worked with abroad, I don't see how Ofsted is adding the value that the amount of stress it causes can justify. So if we could say we've got schools in this country that are, absolutely brilliant, we're top of the PISA tables, whatever they might mean to anybody, we're absolutely confident we've got the best educational system in the world, there may be some justification for the amount of stress that Ofsted causes. But actually, I think it's getting in the way, Tom. I think it is stopping people from really developing the schools for the communities they live in, because by its very nature, an inspection framework is going to be a one-size-fits-all. And yet, where I live, within 2 miles, I can be at Manchester Grammar, and 2 miles the other way can be at a school in very difficult circumstances in the inner city, or in areas like Wythenshawe that have real social challenges, or areas of Salford that do. So I don't feel.
I live in Salford, by the way. We should have done this live.
Yeah, we could have done. We could have done.
Martin, I want to ask you as well, because you've been the lead inspector on T. So presumably there's 3 inspectors, right?
No, it varies, Tom.
3?
It varies. And again, this is another area that I question about quality. So you can work in, if there's tariffs for different inspections. So if you're doing an inspection of a big secondary school, and it's a graded inspection of a big secondary school, you could end up with 4 or 5 inspectors, even more at times. You will often have within that a mix of HMI, so that the people at Ofsted employ, senior HMI, and people like myself who have a day job working in a school but are trained as Ofsted inspectors. So you'll have that. In other schools, smaller schools, you might have effectively 1.5 inspectors, i.e. 2 inspectors on the first day and 1 on the second. So it does vary. And the pressures of inspecting on your own are quite significant. And HMI very experienced at doing it, SHMI are as well, but nonetheless it ends up being quite a singular view.
What do you mean by that, though? Because they're in a team. You're in a team.
Yeah, but you are. But what I'm saying is there are some circumstances where there can be a lone inspector making those final judgments.
Right.
Yeah, and I've experienced that myself. So some special schools are quite small. So, for example, the last one I did, which was a very positive experience all round, was 2 inspectors on the first day and 1 on the second. So when it came to that second day, I was making those judgments on my own. Now, I wasn't pulling them out of thin air, but nonetheless, it was me making those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, my sort of, again, some listening to this would probably say, and feel free to comment, everybody, by the way, who is listening. And thanks, everybody, by the way, who's been listening all the way through. Massive shout out to you people. Susan, shout out to you, Susan. You've been listening all the way through this, so thank you very much. Will's been tweeting. Thanks, Will. And we've got lots of our regular listeners as well. We've got Sam. We've got other people who are always sort of listening to TTR. So good evening to you. Tina as well has been here all the way through. So good evening to you. But I'm sure some of these listeners would say, does the composite, and I know some research was released recently by Sam Sims and some others around the discrepancies between different teams, and they were saying there was a gender difference. Like if you get a team that's with more women in, then you could get maybe a slightly different grade. Maybe it would apply as well if a team of 1 versus a team of 5. I'd be really interested in that comparison, like the size of the team versus the judgment. I think all of this, what critics would say, would be that the size, that there are too many discrepancies.
Yeah, I mean, it's this one size fits all notion, isn't it? I mean, if you take a drive anywhere between, I don't know, just drive south from central Manchester, you'll maybe pass 30 schools, and you maybe pass 30 very, very different establishments. So they're going to need different teams in them. And I've come to think of Ofsted a bit like using a ruler to measure a cloud, in that that a ruler is a form, an instrument by which you can measure, and that a cloud is a system that has things that can be measured, properties that can be measured. But nobody would pretend that it's an adequate way of doing that, because it doesn't pick up the complexity. And one of the issues is that in order to try and address that, Ofsted has different configurations of teams and different ways of building those teams, and they try and put people of certain degrees of experience into those teams, but that doesn't always work. And Kate was talking about the need for subject specialists within the system that she has experience of. There are times, and I've worked on teams where people have been asked to take on subjects that they're not fully aware of. Well, they've had an awareness of, but they've not an expertise in or a skill in, and yet a crucial judgment could hang off that. And I'll go back again to talking about why I became an inspector, was I felt that the field of special education in particular wasn't being well served by people who didn't have a fundamental understanding of the children whose education they were looking at. Hello? Hi, can you hear me?
Hello. Yeah, I think so. Martin, I just dropped out then, or you did. I'm not sure. Can you hear me okay? I
can hear you absolutely fine, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, great. I was just going to say, like, a question that's come in actually from Ashid, who's texted in. He says, do lead inspectors contact local authority directors of education and take their views before or during inspections? Can this influence lead inspectors' judgments and the evidence they're looking for?
Yes. No, they will tend to contact the link local authority officer, and they will also talk to school improvement partners. They can pull in information from, for example, diocesan representatives and things like that. So yeah, they do. It can influence it. The whole process of inspection is around triangulating the ideas and the notions that are emerging. So a bit like Kate talked about alignment within the system in ERA, it's a similar thing in that you're looking to triangulate. And so you might talk to pupils, for example, and say, okay, Mr. Smith said that in maths you've covered these things, and the pupils will say, yeah, we've done that, and yeah, I found it really easy, or I found it really difficult. You would equally phone the local authority officer, or sometimes they will come into the school during the inspection, and you get the opportunity to to interview them.
Yeah. I mean, when you're I was sort of leading towards a question about the sort of point where you have to make the judgment as an inspection team.
Yeah.
And are you in? I mean, what happens when people disagree within the team? Like, how do you deal with that?
I've rarely experienced that. I have experienced it, not when I've led, but when I have been part of teams, I've experienced tension within the team about judgments. And ultimately, it will come down to the lead inspector to direct that conversation, direct that discourse, and thrash it out. And that process can actually be very beneficial, in that you really have to examine the evidence, examine your thinking around it. you within the process, the lead inspector will lead that discussion. As part of the schedule for the day, towards the end of the first day, you'll have what's called a team meeting that school leaders are invited into. So now school leaders aren't participants in that, but they're witnesses to it. And so they will hear the team debating around the judgments. But usually you're using that meeting to confirm what you're thinking, your initial thoughts, and to allow school leaders to glean the nitty gritty, the evidence base for what you're saying. Now, you probably don't want a disagreement as a team in front of those school leaders, otherwise it's going to invalidate your eventual report. But so you'll have tended to have had those disagreements beforehand. But ultimately, you can get to a point where people are unhappy with the verdict. Now, I've not experienced that often, but I have heard stories about it. I think because there is an evidence base to what you're doing as an inspector, you can, more often than not, you can iron that out prior to meeting with school leaders. But it can be a source of tension.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't necessarily talking about in the meeting that you have at the end of the process. I was more talking about during the inspection, how that works. And also, I was going to ask you, I mean, sort of linked to that, like during the inspection, are there any times where you've been like worried about the mental health or well-being of the people you're inspecting, where you thought, do you know what? It doesn't really matter what judgment I give at the end of this. This is not healthy for these people.
Yes. Yeah, I have experienced that. I've experienced it where, let me give you a few different examples. Quite a number of years back, I did an inspection of a school that there was a lot of concern about and was judged to be inadequate, which I think was the right judgment, and was eventually was closed. Now, during that process, the well-being of senior leaders in that school was very, very their mental health. It was very much a concern of the inspectorate team. However, I think that the pressures within that school had already created quite a lot of difficulty for those people, and in some respects, the finality of the decision would have helped them in some respects. However, it's undoubtedly the case that was a very, very difficult process for them. I've also been on the receiving end because I've led organisations that have been everything, right across all four judgments. I've had them all in my career, Tom. And, the inadequate judgment is, it's a terrible blow to an organisation. And it's a far-reaching terrible blow. And I don't think there's any wrapping that up. And it's what I was saying before about we're emotionally enmeshed in our schools, aren't we? As teachers, as leaders, as governors, we're people who do it for the love of kids and the passion for education. So when you are told that you are not very good at it, which is what an inadequate judgment is, there is a real attack on your identity and your selfhood. So yes, I have been worried about leaders and teachers more broadly when giving Ofsted judgments, even when giving strong Ofsted judgment, positives ones, because there is an emotional there's an emotional impact for whatever you're told about something that matters a lot to you. I've sat in judgments where I've graded schools as good, and the head teacher was convinced they were outstanding, and that has been perhaps as damaging to them as being told that the school was of a lower grade.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm sorry, Tom, can I just continue another point as well?
Yeah, please do.
There is a pressure, and I've spoken about this with a number of head teachers of outstanding schools. There is a pressure on having an outstanding school because you've then got to keep it up. And it can restrict schools from developing practice because it might be seen as too risky. It can make schools it can make schools feel that they're answerable to everybody because, well, you're supposed to be an outstanding school. you shouldn't have any difficulties at any point. So there is a pressure with each one of these grades, and it's because there's no way a simple term can capture a complex organisation. It just doesn't do it. And it's far better, for my way of thinking, or the thinking I've evolved, it's far better to have a strong narrative account of what a school is like to be part of, and how that school can improve its practice, and how that school can celebrate its practice, rather than a simplistic judgment like we're, a review on Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was going to sort of come on to your views on how this should change. So, and I know Jennifer is going to join us hopefully in a moment. And Jennifer, I might actually invite you in now, and you can just sort of stay on mute for now while I finish this conversation with Martin. But Martin, I wanted to ask you, how do you think Ofsted need to change? There are those who would say it should be abolished. There are those who would say we just need to stop the grades and that's it. There are those who say it should stay the same. Where do you stand on this?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I think that we do need some sort of regulatory system in the school system, both for accountability and for improvement, and to make sure children are safeguarded. Schools are often the sole, well, not the sole, but they're often a key player in the safeguarding of children. So I think we need a system. I think that there needs to be sort of two timescales worked to for Ofsted, because there's legislature around this, of course. So, the statute demands that, I think it demands that schools that are inadequate are identified for governmental purposes for improvement. So we can't, if we abolished Ofsted overnight, we'd be, I think, giving ourselves even more problems. So I think there needs to be two lanes of progress, and the quickest thing, the most immediate thing that I would do is I would radically alter the reporting process. The inspection process itself is in need of reform, but it's going to be harder to reform that because you're going to have to write a new framework. But I think the reporting process could be changed almost overnight by dropping the grading system and just writing a narrative report. That to me would be a short-term fix, but not a long-term solution. I think the longer-term solution is to go back to the drawing board and over the next year or 18 months, find out what is working well in other countries and do what you're doing, Tom, actually, which is actually reach out, find what other nations in the world do, and then create a system that allows us to build value into schools. There's a great workforce within Ofsted of really experienced, sensitive, passionate and compassionate people amongst their HMI and senior HMI group, who could be reaching out to schools and helping them improve. That they've run schools themselves often. They've certainly got strong views on school improvement, and without the restrictions of the current processes, they could be working as a force for good. Pandemic has been absolutely massive, and I think it's been underestimated by Ofsted that they're now they're looking for norms in these most abnormal of times. Children who have forgotten how to learn, 2 years worth of learning lost. Some kids who didn't start formal learning until they were well above the 6 or 7 years old. Kids in secondary schools who didn't have that really important transition from year 6 to year 7, and so on and so forth, driven a massive hole through schools. Ofsted inspectors, or sorry, HMI could be deployed now to support schools through that process, and just keep inspection for those schools you're worried about in the short term, and put it with HMI.
From working within Ofsted, and by the way, thank you, Jennifer, for joining. I will be bringing you in just a moment. Martin, in terms of Ofsted, do you feel you've worked within the organisation? I mean, okay, you were a contractor, you were coming in and doing inspections, but you still work within, you were trained, you work within Ofsted. Do you think they're a listening organisation? Are the leadership in Ofsted aware? Well, obviously they must be aware because it's been all over the press and the media. But do you think there is a sort of, genuine approach to reform and change, or do you think Ofsted is a listening organisation?
It depends who they're listening to, doesn't it, Tom? I mean, are they listening to frontline practitioners, people with that immediate experience of children and young people? I don't think so. No. Are they listening to other political pressures and demands? Yes, I think they are.
Interesting. And if Amanda Spielman was here now in this space, what would you say to her?
Well, I'd say what I wrote to her, to be honest, Tom. I would say that, you do need to reform what you're doing. I do think Amanda Spielman brought in some good reforms to Ofsted. And, is somebody who does want to do good. But I think there's a naivety in thinking that ploughing on with the current processes that they have is having significant societal benefit to our education system.
My final question, Martin, was going to be about those who would say, hang on a minute, Martin, parents want the grades and society needs the grades and schools are just trying to get out of accountability. What would you say to those people? Because there are lots who would say those
well,
things.
first of all, don't patronise parents would be my first thing. Yes, there are some parents who might have literacy difficulties. There are some parents who might not have English as their first language. And notwithstanding that, I still think that we should credit parents with being able to judge a school by more than a simplistic word or term. My view is that parents don't only rely on Ofsted, do they? I chose schools for my children where I thought they'd be happy, not necessarily where Ofsted said that they were a good school. I mean, they did, as it happens, but that wasn't a deciding factor. So I think we should give credit to parents and carers, more credit to parents and carers. The actual report, I think, ends up often as a really anodyne read, because you're so restricted by language use in terms of compliance and avoiding legal challenge and so on, that you end up writing something that is very stilted and I don't think really talks to parents. So this whole notion that, the grading system and the report is helpful to parents, I think is wrong. I think parents can absorb a decent narrative piece. Parents could also do, there's other ways of reporting than writing a report. You can have meetings with parents, you can have workshops with parents. Ofsted could open its ears and eyes up to other ways of working with people. And in terms of accountability, I'm all for accountability. I think schools should be accountable, and there would be no less rigour in a narrative report. It's just that the reduction of that to simple words and phrases doesn't help an understanding of what a school system needs to do to improve.
Martin, thanks ever so much for joining us tonight. We might need to do a part 2 on this at some point, because I feel like there's so much more I would love to ask you, but time is very limited. So perhaps another time we could explore some of the things you've said, because it's been incredibly interesting. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk, Tom. I do appreciate it.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks a lot. Just another shout out to our fantastic partners on the show tonight, John Catt Education. If you want to find out more and want to see what books they've got available, and they've got some absolutely fantastic ones at the moment, click on the pinned tweet. We've pinned it to the space. But also, if you're listening to this as a podcast, just visit johncattbookshop.com. Have a look at the books and titles that they have to offer you as a teacher, as a professional. There's tons of stuff that can aid you in your professional development. So check those out. And a massive thanks to John Catt for supporting us at Teachers Talk Radio in the work that we do. I'm now joined by Jennifer. Jennifer, if you want to unmute yourself on the bottom left. There we go.
Hi, how are you?
Good evening. I'm not too bad. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Jennifer, it's thanks so much for joining us this evening. I know you've been flying, I think, for the last 24 hours or something ridiculous.
Yeah, it's been a lot of air travel, but yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Jennifer, tell us just really briefly who you are and why I've invited you onto the podcast.
Okay, so I'm a lecturer in education at UCL's IOE, and I specialize in Finland.
Right. So we heard about Ireland from Kate earlier on. And Martin as well, feel free to stay. I've said this to Kate and Martin, that it'd be great to sort of, if you did want to stick around, Martin, then feel free to do so just the last 20 minutes. And I might ask you.
I will do, Tom.
Brilliant.
Interested to listen to you, Jennifer.
Yes. So Jennifer, I just want to ask then, Finland, right? How does it do teacher and school inspection and accountability?
So it's very, very different. If memory is serving me right now, after all this travel, I believe inspections were abolished in 1994.
Yes.
I believe that's the date. That's the one that's popping in my head. So now schools self-inspect.
Yes, I think you're right.
Yeah, any sort of sense. So they evaluate themselves as opposed to being externally evaluated.
So, I mean, do you know much about that in terms of what teachers or schools, how they self-evaluate themselves? Like on what basis, on what, what are the criteria? What are the things that Finnish schools sort of value in their schools, and how do they evaluate themselves?
So this isn't my greatest area of expertise, but I can tell you that schools decide amongst themselves and with stakeholders. So it'll be kind of head teachers and parents and teachers, and maybe if the students are older, some students as well, and then to discuss how it's gone over the year, what's gone well, what perhaps hasn't, what can they improve upon. All of these things. Yes.
How would you, because obviously you work in the UK, so you must be aware of the way the English or British education system sort of works in that sense. So I was wondering if you could shed some light on the key differences between England and Finland.
Okay, so I would say the first thing I would say is a lack of trust in England and trust in Finland. And a lot of that is, well, it's historical and sociocultural, but also all teachers have a master's degree. So we have a really highly educated profession where students of teacher education go through a rigorous admissions process, 3 years of undergrad, 2 years of master's, and 2 dissertations as well. So what you have in Finland is a very trusted and respected profession that is very, very autonomous and teachers have agency as well. So that is, to me, the biggest difference is the trust in the teachers and trust in education as a society.
And you've been doing some research, haven't you, on the sort of Finnish education system?
Yes.
What are the sort of key findings that you found from that research?
So my doctoral research looked at why Finland did so well in PISA, and then my postdoctoral research looked at teachers and teacher education. And I would say the biggest thing is teachers and teacher education. And then through this master's degree, then having the autonomous profession where teachers are trusted to do as they see fit.
Got you. Okay. I mean, do you because obviously you've probably heard the conversation that we've had here, and you talked about this idea of trust in Finland that is sort of lacking here. Is that what's the answer to that then?
So I would say, I can kind of see why it exists as a quality assurance measure, but inspections, I would say, point to a lack of trust in the system. I think that's the biggest thing here is, would you be inspecting schools if you didn't trust them to carry out as they saw fit?
Yeah, this is it. I don't know whether Martin or Kate, I don't know whether you guys want to come in with any sort of comments or questions at this point. Just sort of reflecting what Jennifer said so far.
Yeah, I mean that word trust it's absolutely crucial to the whole teaching relationship, isn't it? I mean, you establish trust with the children you're teaching, and that's how you help them to learn, and that has to be part of the whole inspection framework or regulatory framework, however you bring it in. It's really interesting, isn't it, that they've not had any sort of inspection process for 30 years in Finland, and yet they seem to be doing okay.
Yeah. I mean, I've met a teacher of English, and she decided not to use textbooks. She decided that the students wanted to read Harry Potter, so they were just going to read Harry Potter. And as things came up, like grammar points or vocabulary or anything, that's when those teachable moments would arise. And wow, how about what an inspired teacher, but then also the school allowing her to do that. It's like, yeah, I'm just going to check out these textbooks. We're just going to read what the students want to do. It's called Harry Potter. And then we'll get to the end through this. And, you know, the head teacher was, okay. I trust you.
I feel, can I ask another question, Tom, of Jennifer?
Sure.
Yeah, please do, Martin. Please do.
Isn't it interesting that what you're really revealing there, Jennifer, is the societal place of education in Finland? It's not just about regulation, this is it. It's that teachers are more highly respected, that they're trained to a very high degree, and therefore they are thoroughly professionalised. Whereas I think that in our country, teachers are still shackled by not only Ofsted, not only DFE, but also a lot of cultural impressions of what a teacher is. Is that a fair comment, Jennifer?
Yeah, I would say so. I think the way that, I mean, just having an inspectorate or just the education of a teacher is different. It's looked at a bit more like training, learning, a technical skill in England towards that end of a continuum, whereas in Finland it's very, very research based, very scholarship based, very theoretically based, and and then you're considered to be quite a scholar. And then for primary programs for teacher education, it's traditionally been about a 10% acceptance rate. So you have literally the brightest students going into teaching.
I'd be in trouble then, Martin and Jennifer.
Oh, don't be self-down, Tom.
Jennifer, I was gonna ask you about. I mean, you must have spoken to a lot of Finnish teachers, right, through your research and whatever. Because a lot of teachers in England would say the spectre of accountability hangs over them. You know, whether that be Ofsted, whether that be their leaders, whether that be league tables, whatever. They feel very much under pressure to hit certain metrics, whatever those metrics are, right? So I was wondering, I mean, you probably haven't measured how Finnish teachers feel about the way but I was wondering if you've got anything anecdotal about the conversations you've had with Finnish teachers. I mean, what are the pressures they feel, and would those pressures maybe be different from teachers here?
I think they feel very autonomous. I would say I was speaking to student teachers as well as mentor teachers as regular classroom or subject teachers, and they do feel very autonomous. The student teachers didn't feel they were imposed upon in terms of a style or a way of teaching. It was really to find their own way, their own teaching style, really. And I think another reason for this is the lack of testing in Finland. So the only national test is the matriculation exam at the end of upper secondary school. So there's not this, reception baseline and then phonics screening test and then SATs at 7 and 11 and then, GCSEs and school inspectorates and this and this. So teachers feel really autonomous. I met a first year teacher who did the same. He decided not to use the textbook and do something else. The head teacher's like, go for it. I trust you. And I thought that was extremely powerful for a first year teacher to have that confidence, and then B, for the head teacher just to say, I trust you, do what you want,
That's really Kate, go on.
Yeah, can I ask? Yeah, I want to ask you that, Jennifer. In Finland, is there? You talk about the head teacher there being fine with the early career teacher, making this decision in their classroom. Is there much accountability, say, at a school level in terms of oversight by management of teachers' work within the school? Because I think in Ireland we're very autonomous within our classrooms.
Yeah, I would say almost every head teacher and teacher I spoke to, they said they felt very autonomous. It's a devolved system in Finland, so it's really by municipality in terms of how they carry out their education. But then the head teachers say it's really by school, and then it's up to the teachers how they want to conduct things in their own classrooms as well. So
Katie, I might just bring Katie in now. Katie, if you want to unmute yourself in the bottom left, if you want to ask.
Oh, yeah, I have you.
Hi. Go ahead, Katie. You want to say something?
Yeah. Is that you talking to me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Fire
Thank
away.
you. Thank you very much. Thanks for giving me a mic. I had a question for Jennifer, if that's all right.
Go for it.
Okay. I actually was on one of your spaces a couple of nights ago. You keep going about the offset and talk to you. And I'm from Italy, and I'm worked in both the state school and private school. I have a question for Jennifer, because actually the system she was explaining in Finland is really, really interesting to me as an autonomous teacher, but not having the inspector, like exterior inspector. But how do they assess? Like if a teacher is so free to choose a storybook of like Harry Potter and study it and teach it, how do they actually assess the students in the end? How do they know that worked very well for the students, or within a system, or for like maybe 5-year program of teaching English at a school? Could Jennifer explain that to me? Would be really nice. Thank you.
Sure.
That's a good question.
Yeah, that is I get this question a lot, and it tends to be from people with Anglo backgrounds. To say, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? And I think
Katie's Italian. So.
Yeah, I know. This
I'm
is
not
like,
Italian. Actually, I'm Iranian, but
wow,
I've been living
okay.
around the world for past 20 years, and I've been teaching in many different countries. So now in the past 5 years, I'm in Italy. So it's been really crazy around. I have experience with different education systems within different continents. But this is like really interesting to me. If Jennifer can explain that to me, it could be really nice.
Sure. So there's
because here in a school I'm talking about is one of the very prestigious school here. They're working with IB system, so that is like what they're doing. But it's like full of assessment, like so many assessment they have to do about students individually, classroom system. And what you explain is really interesting. I'd like to hear your answer. Thank you.
Sure. So there is a national core curriculum, which is regulated centrally by the government. And Finns like to stress the core part of the curriculum, meaning it's slimmed down. It's not too prescriptive. So they do have to follow a national curriculum, if that answers your question. So, and teachers will assess within their own classrooms. So it's not a nationally administered test, but it is a test within the classroom for, I guess, measuring where their students have hit the national core curriculum goals or not.
Does that answer your question, Katie? You got anything further to add?
Yeah, I did. So they actually like compare their assessment to something like as a national curriculum. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so they have something to measure their performance in the classroom. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's really interesting. By the way, if anyone else has sort of, we've only got about 5 minutes left, but if anybody else has any questions for Jennifer, then you can just reply in the chat on the bottom left, and we'll ask Jennifer the questions.
And there's I think what people were talking about was kind of what now with OFSTED. if no OFSTED, then what? And what I've also learned by studying the education system of Finland is the time scale needed for actual policy change. So the Finns decided to move teacher education or teacher training at the time to the university level. So this was decided kind of late 60s, early 70s. And then by the late 70s, 1970s, all teachers needed to have a master's degree. And then people moaned, do teachers really need a master's degree? And because education's free in Finland, it's very expensive for the government. And then what happened 30 years later, PISA came out. And then everyone's kind of like, oh, okay. So there really is a long-term scale of policy change. So yeah, if Ofsted just disappeared tomorrow, then okay, there'd be a lot of upheaval. So if there is to be some sort of long-term policy change, there really needs to be long-term vision that's agreed upon by politicians. I would say in this country is very difficult because as an observer of what happens every time there is a government change, I feel like there's education policy change.
But does that not happen in Finland?
Much less so. So in general, there's been political consensus about education, and the way they need to make coalitions in the government to make a parliamentary majority, there has to be working together. That being said, there was an election Sunday, and there's, I think, going to be some very interesting coalition building. So, yeah, but traditionally, yes, there is political consensus.
There's
about
more consensus.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, Jennifer, I wondered, based on everything we've talked about tonight, and you've heard the guests talking and so on, what would be, and based on all your studies of Finland, what if you were advising the government in England about school inspection and Ofsted reform, what, based on your research, what would be your advice then? Would you say go to a self-evaluation system, go to a system more in terms of what like clusters of schools who evaluate each other, maybe peer review, self-review? Like, what would your advice be?
I would say slow change. So instead of let's all chuck it out the window today, have a vision for how long it would take realistically. And I think it's bigger than Ofsted as well. I think Ofsted is a symptom of a much larger situation, which is a lack of trust in the education system, over evaluation. Kind of this notion of testing and accountability is very, very rampant in the English education system. So kind of looking at all the angles as opposed to just one slice of everything. I do like that peer idea that you've just put out.
Well, I was doing some research for this show, and in, I think it's, Bulgaria, they have clusters of schools who basically, I'm not even going to use the word inspect, review each other. And they do it in sort of school clusters, and it's very sort of soft evaluation. There's no sort of hard judgments in there. It's collaborative and so on. So that's just one example I was looking at.
Tom, can I come here?
Yeah, Martin, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you, and just to pick up Jennifer's point there. I've worked as part of clusters of schools supporting one another, and they have been the biggest agents for positive change in the schools I've worked in, without a shadow of doubt, because you've got people who understand what you're doing, live what you're doing every day, genuinely trying to find better ways of helping one another improve.
I mean, one of the criticisms of that style that I read, and actually people have said this to me on social media, is the idea that if you were in a cluster of schools that were in your locality, would there be too much bias or too much chumness in the process to actually create difficult conversations and all the rest of it?
Yeah.
But peer review doesn't have to be clusters of schools that they can be clusters of schools outside of your locality.
Yeah, I mean, as special schools, you have the opportunity. We worked across Greater Manchester, so the key thing is you weren't in competition with one another, and I understand that's different for mainstream schools. But yeah, I'm sure there are ways of doing that doesn't create the sort of problems that you've identified there. But it's Jennifer's whole point about trust, isn't it? Education is built around trust, and actually we should be feeding it into the ways we make schools accountable. It should be based on a trust system.
Well, absolutely, and I guess the idea of school self-evaluation is fundamentally built on trust, because it's saying you're a professional, and because you're a professional, we trust you to evaluate yourself.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental of that system, in my opinion. From what I've read about it. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we've sort of come to the conclusion that a lot of this is about trust in educators within different contexts. I mean, we heard from Kate at the beginning in Ireland. It sounds like, talking about parents who, I mean, Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like parents in Ireland, based on what you said, do probably trust the teachers a little bit more maybe than in from what we're saying in England, because you were saying that they rarely look at they rarely sort of question, I don't know, I'm not going to say the quality of the schools, but like they don't read those reports as much.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of trust traditionally. I think it has eroded. I think since 2008, I think a lot of trust maybe in public institutions has maybe eroded a little bit. I do think parents don't necessarily assume that the school is doing. I mean, most of the time, I think there is a very high level of trust there. But I think that parents talk to each other. I think word of mouth is just really, really important, and a lot of parents do keep in touch with the school. They go to parent teacher meetings. They do keep quite an eye on what their children are doing in school and how they're doing in school. It's just that I think that the inspection reports aren't necessarily seen as the first. They certainly wouldn't be the first line of it certainly wouldn't be the first place that the parents would go to look if they had questions about anything that was going on in the school. I think they'd be much more likely to ask each other, ask the child. It's kind of encouraged that there'd be a lot of communication between schools and parents, and the parents, anytime they can get in contact with the school, they can contact their children's teacher. They can, if they have concerns, they can come in and meet with staff in schools. And I think that that's more where parents get their information from. I think the inspection reports that are kind of used within the education system itself kind of as a carrot that affirms good practice, and that's something to aspire to, that you get a good inspection report rather than a stick that's used to beat people.
Got you. Right, we're coming towards the end now, so I'm going to go around everybody and just ask you, if you were to choose between an inspection system that was like the one in England, should we call that a sort of external body judgment on schools by an external body sort of system, versus a peer review system, versus a self-review system, versus nothing, right? So if I was to present you those four options: external body assessing schools and teachers, whether that's with grades or not, we're not sort of saying that, but external body that doesn't know the schools, self-review, peer review, or nothing, no review, and just sort of leaving it to professionals to develop themselves. Jennifer, I'll start with you. Out of those four options, which one would you choose and why?
For England, I would say, if possible, a mix of peer and self for the next stages of kind of post
development.
Yeah, I would say if I could choose both.
You can't. If you had to
Okay.
choose, you've got to choose one, I'm afraid.
Okay, I would say then, if we're abolishing OFSTED, then.
So you go for nothing.
Yeah, I would say a peer, but then long term, maybe to do something else in the future. But if it's the first step out of it, I would say a peer review.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jennifer. Martin?
I'm going to be as awkward as Jennifer, Tom.
You're not allowed, though.
Right, okay. Well, even though I'm not allowed to do this, what I would do, I mean, I would go for self review endorsed by a group of peers led by an HMI.
Okay. Interesting. Kate?
I'm going to be the third awkward person, and I do agree with Martin and with Jennifer that some kind of a hybrid. I think you need to have some kind of a hybrid system where the limitations to each system are recognised, because you do have there moves here around school self-evaluation, but then part of the inspection is that they look at how you're doing school self-evaluation. So I do think self-evaluation and some kind of inspection, but that the limits of inspection are recognised. That
Brilliant.
There's so much goes on in schools that inspection can't really capture.
And
so
Katie, I don't know
have
whether
to go to some kind of hybrid.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And Katie, I don't know whether you want to sort of chip in with your 2 pennies on this, if you have.
Thank you. Thanks for including me. I really agree with that self-assessment, and then of course peer assessment, because as a self-assessment, I would say, like, we all teachers, we really know what's going on, like what we're lacking, or what's our weak points and our strong points. But then, like, a peer one's really helpful, because maybe it helps us to see outside of the box. Otherwise, not more than that very much.
Well, that was an interesting end to tonight's show, because I think everybody said sort of peer/self-review. So that's interesting. It's been absolutely fascinating. Massive thanks to Kate, to Jennifer, to Katie, and to Martin for joining me this evening for the Late Show on TTR. This will be available as a podcast through all good podcast platforms. Possibly tonight, possibly first thing in the morning, but it'll be available very soon. If you follow Teachers Talk Radio on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, then you can hear a replay of this show. And if you are listening to that replay and you've got this far, thank you very much indeed. We will be back on Teachers Talk Radio tomorrow. So get ready, 7:30 p.m. tomorrow. Lucy Newberger will be here for the space for the Late Show on a Tuesday. So if you want some more Teachers Talk Radio, you can tune into that tomorrow evening, 7:30 p.m. Huge thanks to every single listener, especially those who have been with us right from the word go, and to all of our listeners who might be listening back to this. Thank you very much, and we will hear from you, not see you, but hear from you maybe again very soon. And good night.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.